In the quiet town of Fairview, Ohio, the Thompson family appeared to be the epitome of suburban harmony. Richard, the patriarch, was a respected civil engineer known for his calm demeanor and solid principles. With an easy smile and brown hair starting to show streaks of gray, he was the family's foundation. By his side was Elizabeth, a warm and kind woman who dedicated her days to their home and the education of their children. Known for her charismatic nature with bright blue eyes and blonde hair that seemed to glisten under the autumn sun, she was the heart of their household. Together they created a home that, to the neighbors, was the perfect picture of American happiness. The children completed this idyllic image. Their two biological daughters, Emily and Grace, brought an air of lightness to the household. Emily, the eldest at 16, was a studious and dedicated young woman, always with a book in hand and a sharp response at the ready. Grace, just 12, was a bundle of energy, her contagious laughter and endless creativity filling the home with life. Alongside them were their adopted daughters Chloe and Sabrina, who joined the family at different points, carrying with them life stories marked by challenges. 14-year-old Chloe, introverted and artistically inclined, loved spending hours sketching in her notebook. Sabrina, the eldest at 17, had an intense and reserved personality, her presence sometimes unsettling. The Thompsons' house, a classic two-story structure with a white picket fence, seemed to house a dreamlike life. Family dinners were filled with laughter and discussions about the day's events. To outsiders, they were a model family, inspiring admiration and even a touch of envy. Yet what no one could see was that beneath this facade of perfection, tiny cracks were beginning to form. Cracks that, one day, would bring the entire structure crashing down. Before arriving at the Thompson household, Sabrina's childhood had been marked by instability and pain. Growing up in a chaotic environment, she was all too familiar with neglect, with biological parents more focused on feeding their own addictions than caring for their children. Her father, a man with a volatile temper, often vented his frustrations on his wife and children, turning the home into an emotional and physical battleground. Her mother, on the other hand, sought escape in substance abuse, leaving Sabrina and her siblings adrift in a house that should have been a haven but was instead a constant source of fear. The nights were especially hard for Sabrina. She learned to sleep with one eye open, dreading the arguments that inevitably erupted and echoed through the house. When the fights escalated, she would hide in a closet or under her bed, hugging her knees and trying to stifle her sobs. A particularly scarring memory occurred when, at just 8 years old, she witnessed a fight that ended with furniture broken and the police at their door. These moments left emotional scars and shaped her worldview, a place where trust was non-existent and love was nothing more than a broken promise. When Sabrina was finally removed from her parents' custody and placed into the foster care system, she felt a mix of relief and abandonment. Though she was away from the toxic environment of her childhood, the foster system brought its own challenges. Moving through multiple homes, she experienced varying degrees of acceptance. Some families treated her as a burden, while others merely tolerated her presence. These experiences pushed Sabrina further inward, building walls between herself and the world. By the time she was adopted by the Thompsons at age 13, she carried not only the weight of her trauma but also a silent hope for stability and genuine love. When Sabrina joined the Thompson family, Richard seemed to embody everything she had ever wanted in a father. He was calm, attentive, and showed a care Sabrina had never experienced in her chaotic past. In the first few months, she felt more at ease with him than with anyone else in the house. Richard was patient, listened to her childhood stories, and assured her that she would never have to endure such hardships again. To Sabrina, he quickly became a safe haven, someone who genuinely seemed to care about her well-being, a stark contrast to the father figures she had known before. Over time, however, the bond between them began to take an unsettling turn. Richard's behavior, initially paternal, grew increasingly intrusive. He started spending too much time alone with Sabrina, touching her shoulder for just a moment too long or offering compliments that seemed overly affectionate. Sabrina, with her history of trauma, struggled to interpret these actions. Part of her wanted to believe it was just his way of showing care, But another part sensed something was wrong, a faint echo of the patterns she had endured in her past. Their relationship devolved into a cycle of emotional dependency and manipulation. Richard made Sabrina feel special, as though he understood her in a way no one else could. Yet these displays of affection came with increasingly inappropriate demands, cloaked in the guise of trust and closeness. Sabrina, deeply scarred by years of rejection and neglect, feared losing the only connection she believed she had. This fear kept her compliant, even as the dynamic became more toxic. She lived in a constant state of confusion and guilt, trapped in a pattern that mirrored the very abuse she thought she had left behind. Elizabeth had always been vigilant about what went on in her home. Initially, she saw the bond between Richard and Sabrina as a positive development, believing he was helping the young girl adjust to her new life. However, small details began to unsettle her. The extended time Richard spent alone with Sabrina, the whispered conversations that abruptly ended when she entered the room, and the way Sabrina seemed both grateful and uncomfortable around him, all of it raised red flags. Elizabeth's intuition, honed over years of managing her household, told her something was amiss. As the weeks passed, Elizabeth's unease grew into outright suspicion. She started paying closer attention, observing interactions with a sharper eye. One night, while passing Richard's office, she heard muffled laughter and realized he was alone with Sabrina, far too late for it to be a casual conversation. The unease turned to certainty when she discovered messages on Richard's phone exchanged with Sabrina. These messages crossed the boundaries of what could be deemed appropriate, laced with a tone of intimacy that no father should have with his child. When Elizabeth confronted Richard, he denied everything, claiming he was simply helping Sabrina feel part of the family. But the tension reached a boiling point when Elizabeth, frustrated and furious, confronted Sabrina directly. "I know what's going on," she said, her voice a mix of anger and heartbreak. Sabrina, caught off guard, tried to deny it, but her expression betrayed her. Feeling betrayed by both her husband and Sabrina, Elizabeth made a drastic decision. Sabrina would have to leave. "You should never have come here," she spat, her words cutting like a knife. For Sabrina, the rejection was devastating, reopening old wounds of abandonment. The tension in the house became unbearable, and Sabrina, desperate and terrified, began to feel as though her presence there was not just unwanted but untenable. Richard knew that the situation at home had become untenable. Elizabeth's growing hostility toward Sabrina had turned the once peaceful household into a battleground. One tense night, as Sabrina sat alone in her room, Richard decided it was time to act. He knocked softly on her door and entered, finding her curled up on the bed, her face a mixture of fear and frustration. "We can be together," he said in a low, persuasive voice. Sabrina looked up, confused and intrigued. "But for that to happen, we need to get rid of Elizabeth." Richard's proposal was delivered with an alarming sense of calm, as if he were discussing a simple household matter. He laid out his plan step by step with chilling precision. Elizabeth had a $1 million life insurance policy, Richard explained, money that could solve all their problems and allow them to start over far away from Fairview. "With that money, we could live the life we've always dreamed of," he said, placing a reassuring hand on Sabrina's shoulder. His tone was calculated, designed to make her feel like an essential part of the plan. Sabrina, shocked at first, found herself slowly drawn in by Richard's confident promises and the vision of a future she had always longed for. The plan was cold and methodical. Richard suggested making the crime look like an outburst of rage or an accident, ensuring Sabrina could claim temporary insanity if caught. He promised to handle everything afterward, from collecting the insurance money to arranging their escape. Sabrina, vulnerable to his emotional manipulation and desperate for love and acceptance, hesitated but couldn't bring herself to refuse outright. "Trust me," Richard said, locking eyes with her. His words felt like both a reassurance and a command. Despite the dread building in her chest, Sabrina felt trapped, unable to resist his influence. She had no idea she was being drawn into a devastating scheme that would lead them both down a path of no return. The night Richard's plan was to be executed, the Thompson home was eerily quiet, as if the house itself sensed the impending tragedy. Richard summoned Sabrina to his office, where a bottle of whiskey sat open on the desk. Sabrina hesitated at the threshold, uneasy about the scene before her. "This will help you relax," Richard said, pouring her a generous glass. He handed it to her with a calm yet insistent gaze. Alongside the drink he produced a small bag of white powder. "Just a little, it'll give you the courage you need," he assured her. Exhausted and emotionally fragile, Sabrina complied, drinking and inhaling without protest. As the alcohol and cocaine coursed through her system, Sabrina's thoughts became a chaotic swirl. Richard leaned in, speaking softly but firmly, reinforcing every detail of the plan. "Remember, it's her or us," he whispered, repeating the mantra that had become his justification. He outlined the steps she needed to take, from entering Elizabeth's room to how she should act afterward. "If you're caught, say it was a moment of insanity," he instructed, his tone a mix of reassurance and command. His words wrapped around her like a net, ensnaring her further in his scheme. Sabrina, clouded by substances and overwhelmed by fear, nodded in dazed agreement. Before leaving the house, Richard looked at Sabrina one last time. She was visibly disoriented, her hands trembling as she clutched the knife he had placed in them. He cupped her face with both hands, staring into her eyes with an intensity that was both comforting and oppressive. "You can do this. It's for us. I'll be back soon," he said before slipping out the door. The sound of it closing behind him felt deafening in the silence that followed. Left alone in the dimly lit house, Sabrina sat motionless, the weight of the plan and the knife in her hands pressing down on her. The voice of Richard echoed in her mind, guiding her toward an act she couldn't yet fully comprehend. As Sabrina stood outside Elizabeth's bedroom, the knife quivered in her clammy hands. The effects of the alcohol, cocaine, and fear coursing through her veins left her teetering on the edge of collapse. The soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated Elizabeth's peaceful face as she slept, oblivious to the storm brewing just outside her door. Sabrina froze, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and guilt. "I can't do this," she whispered to herself, taking a hesitant step back. For a brief moment, the weight of what she was about to do seemed unbearable, and she considered abandoning the plan entirely. Then her phone vibrated in her pocket. With trembling hands she pulled it out and read Richard's message. "If you don't do this, you'll be on the street tomorrow. No one will want you, Sabrina. Think about it." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, reigniting her deepest fears of rejection and abandonment. She could almost hear Richard's voice repeating his cruel ultimatum. The thought of losing the only connection she believed she had, the one person who promised her love and acceptance, pushed her over the edge. Tears streamed down Sabrina's face as she took shaky steps into the room. Her breathing was erratic, her vision blurred by the haze of drugs and despair. Richard's words echoed in her mind like a dark chant. "It's her or us." The internal battle raging within her dissolved into chaos, and a psychotic break took hold. She gripped the knife tightly, her knuckles white as she approached Elizabeth's bedside. The part of her that wanted to stop, to drop the knife and run, was drowned out by the overwhelming pressure and fear Richard had instilled in her. The point of no return had arrived. Sabrina stepped closer to Elizabeth, her entire body trembling as the knife felt heavier in her hands with each passing second. The soft rhythm of Elizabeth's breathing filled the room, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside Sabrina's mind. For a brief moment she stood frozen, staring down at the woman who had given her a home, wrestling with a storm of guilt and fear. But Richard's words echoed relentlessly in her head. "It's her or us." With a sudden surge of desperation, she raised the knife and brought it down. The first strike was hesitant, met with a gasp as Elizabeth woke, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. Sabrina, now gripped by a psychotic frenzy, lost all sense of reality. The act became frenzied and uncontrollable, a release of years of pain, rejection, and manipulation. Each stab seemed to carry the weight of her past traumas, the betrayal she felt, and the desperate need for the future Richard had promised her. The brutal attack continued until the room fell silent, save for Sabrina's ragged breaths. When it was over, Sabrina stumbled backward, dropping the bloodied knife to the floor. The room, once a place of warmth and comfort, had transformed into a nightmarish scene. Blood spattered the walls, the sheets, and even Sabrina herself. She collapsed to her knees beside the bed, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she stared at Elizabeth's lifeless body. The gravity of what she had done began to sink in, though her mind struggled to process the horror of her actions. Sabrina sat in stunned silence, her bloodied hands clutching her head as the reality of the situation overwhelmed her. The promise of freedom and love Richard had dangled before her now seemed like a cruel mirage. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, as the weight of the irreversible act consumed her. The world around her felt eerily quiet, the silence broken only by the faint sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. As Sabrina sat in the dimly lit bedroom, frozen in the aftermath of her actions, faint footsteps echoed from the hallway. Grace, the youngest of the Thompson children, had woken to the muffled sounds of the struggle. Rubbing her eyes, she tiptoed toward her parents' room, curiosity mingled with a sense of unease. When she pushed the slightly ajar door open, the sight before her froze her in place. The once serene bedroom was now a scene of unspeakable horror. Sabrina, drenched in blood, knelt by the bed, staring blankly at Elizabeth's lifeless body. Grace stifled a scream, her small hands trembling as she backed away from the doorway. Tears filled her eyes as panic overtook her, and she bolted down the hall to the kitchen. Reaching for the phone, she dialed 911 with shaking fingers. "Please help," she cried into the receiver. "My sister, she hurt my mom. There's blood everywhere." The dispatcher worked to calm Grace as she relayed the details through sobs, instructing her to find a safe place until help arrived. It didn't take long for the wailing sirens of police cars to pierce the night, their flashing lights illuminating the otherwise quiet Fairview neighborhood. Officers entered the home cautiously, guided by Grace's tearful directions. When they reached the master bedroom, the scene before them was grim. Sabrina was still on the floor, her hands and clothes soaked in blood, the knife lying discarded nearby. She didn't resist as the officers approached. Her expression was one of vacant shock, as though she were entirely disconnected from her surroundings. The police quickly secured the scene, while paramedics pronounced Elizabeth dead. Sabrina was led out in handcuffs, her gaze fixed on the ground, the weight of her actions beginning to dawn on her. In the hallway, Grace watched from a distance, her young face pale and tear-streaked as she clutched a blanket for comfort. The sight of Sabrina, her adopted sister, being taken away left her feeling a mix of fear, confusion, and heartbreak. The once perfect Thompson household had become the epicenter of a tragedy that no one in the town could have imagined. From the moment the police arrived, there was little doubt about the identity of Elizabeth's killer. Sabrina had been caught at the scene, drenched in blood, with the murder weapon lying just a few feet away. The brutality of the crime, 178 stab wounds, was shocking, and the evidence against her seemed overwhelming. Investigators quickly pieced together the events of that night, concluding that Sabrina had carried out the attack in a psychotic state fueled by manipulation and coercion. To the authorities, it was an open and shut case of a calculated and deliberate murder. When the case went to trial, Sabrina's defense team argued passionately that she was a victim of Richard's manipulation. They painted a vivid picture of her life, a childhood filled with abuse and neglect, her vulnerabilities exploited by a man she trusted. They presented psychological evaluations detailing her fragile mental state and explained how Richard had supplied her with drugs and pressured her into committing the crime. She wasn't acting of her own free will, one lawyer stated. She was a puppet in Richard's scheme. Sabrina sat silently in the courtroom, her face a mixture of remorse and despair. However, the prosecution countered with the undeniable facts of the case. They focused on the premeditated nature of the crime, presenting Richard's text messages as evidence that Sabrina had willingly followed his plan. They argued that while Richard's influence was clear, Sabrina had ultimately carried out the brutal act herself. The jury was shown crime scene photos that highlighted the sheer violence of the attack, leaving many in the courtroom visibly shaken. After days of deliberation, the jury rejected the insanity plea. While they acknowledged the role Richard had played, they concluded that Sabrina was fully aware of her actions that night. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 30 years. As the sentence was read, Sabrina remained stoic, her gaze fixed on the floor. The verdict brought closure for the prosecution, but for Sabrina, it was a somber reminder of the devastating path her life had taken. As Sabrina began serving her sentence, the full scope of Richard's betrayal came to light. While she languished in prison, Richard executed the next phase of his plan, disappearing. Using the $1 million from Elizabeth's life insurance policy, he fabricated an image of a grieving widower and ensured no immediate suspicion fell upon him. With the money in hand, he vanished, leaving no trace of his whereabouts. To the outside world, he was a devastated man trying to cope with the loss of his wife, but in reality he was a fugitive enjoying the fruits of his manipulative scheme. In the solitude of her prison cell, Sabrina began to piece together the truth. The haze of drugs and psychological coercion that had clouded her mind during the crime slowly dissipated. She replayed every conversation, every promise Richard had made, and saw it for what it was: a calculated manipulation. He had never intended to share a life with her. She was merely a pawn in his quest for freedom and financial gain. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, bringing with it a mix of rage, regret, and profound sadness. Sabrina confided in her legal team, sharing her suspicions about Richard's involvement and ultimate betrayal. She recounted details of his instructions, the promises of a future together, and the relentless pressure he had applied. "He used me," she told them, her voice trembling with emotion. Everything he said was a lie. Her lawyers began building a case to expose Richard's role in the crime, using the messages and other evidence as a foundation. For Sabrina, the hope of implicating him offered a glimmer of justice in the otherwise bleak reality of her incarceration. Meanwhile, Richard's freedom was fleeting. Law enforcement launched an investigation into his disappearance, uncovering inconsistencies in his alibi and financial activities. His carefully constructed facade began to crumble as the authorities pieced together his role in Elizabeth's murder. Sabrina's testimony and the mounting evidence against him painted a damning picture of a man who orchestrated a heinous crime and left others to bear the consequences. Months passed as Sabrina's legal team worked tirelessly to bring Richard to justice. One day, during a routine meeting with her attorneys, Sabrina mentioned something she had kept hidden from the chaos of that fateful night: her old phone, the one she had buried in the yard before the crime. Despite the guilt and confusion that clouded her mind, she instinctively knew it was the key to proving her innocence and exposing Richard's true role in the murder. With determination, she asked her lawyers to recover the phone from its hiding place. The authorities, initially skeptical, agreed to excavate the yard where Sabrina had hidden the phone. When the device was found, the messages between her and Richard were still intact. The texts were a smoking gun, exposing Richard's manipulation in explicit detail. He had not only coerced her into committing the murder but had also instructed her on how to cover it up and provided her with the means to carry out the act. One message read, "If you don't do this, you'll never be part of my life again. You need to prove you belong with me." Another detailed the exact steps she needed to take to make the crime appear like a moment of temporary insanity. These messages were irrefutable evidence of Richard's direct involvement in the crime. With the new evidence in hand, Sabrina's legal team pushed for the reopening of her case. The prosecution was forced to reconsider, as the messages clearly demonstrated Richard's role as the mastermind behind Elizabeth's death. Sabrina, once seen as the sole perpetrator, was now viewed as a victim of emotional manipulation and psychological control. The court agreed to revisit the case, and a new trial was set to hold Richard accountable for his actions. As news of the development spread, Richard's fate seemed increasingly certain. Law enforcement intensified their search for him, and his carefully constructed life began to unravel. It was only a matter of time before he would be found. The new evidence gathered from Sabrina's phone sent shockwaves through the legal system. Sabrina's defense team worked tirelessly to present the case that Richard had been the true orchestrator of Elizabeth's murder. With the messages detailing his manipulation and coercion, the prosecution could no longer deny the extent of his involvement. Sabrina's once bleak future began to shift as the court recognized the significant role Richard had played in the crime. Sabrina's sentencing was revisited. After careful consideration, the judge reduced her sentence, acknowledging the emotional and psychological toll Richard's manipulation had taken on her. Though Sabrina would still serve time for her involvement, the new trial led to a significant reduction in her sentence. She was now facing 20 years with the possibility of parole after 15. It was a bittersweet victory. While Sabrina still had to face the consequences of her actions, she no longer carried the full burden of guilt for the murder of Elizabeth. The weight of Richard's deceit and control was now exposed for all to see. In the meantime, the authorities intensified their search for Richard. The once elusive man who had disappeared with Elizabeth's life insurance money was now a fugitive on the run. His trail grew colder by the day, but as his past was scrutinized, the pieces of his carefully hidden life began to unravel. After months of investigation, Richard was finally tracked down in a small village in Mexico, where he had assumed a false identity. He was arrested and extradited back to the United States, where he faced charges of conspiracy to commit murder, manipulation, and financial fraud. Richard's trial was a long and public affair. His cold demeanor and calculated actions were exposed in court, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Sabrina, the news of his conviction brought a sense of relief, though the damage caused by his manipulation could never be fully undone. 15 years into her sentence, Sabrina stood before the parole board, her future uncertain. The years had been difficult, but they had also allowed her time for reflection and growth. She had undergone extensive therapy and rehabilitation, slowly untangling the emotional knots that Richard had tied so tightly in her life. Sabrina had come to understand the depth of the manipulation she had suffered, and while she could never fully erase the past, she had learned to forgive herself. During her time in prison, Sabrina found a sense of purpose. She became involved in programs aimed at helping others who had been abused or manipulated. She worked with organizations dedicated to supporting women and girls who had been victims of emotional and psychological abuse. Sabrina shared her story with others, using her experience to help them recognize the signs of manipulation and control, and to find their own strength to break free. When she was granted parole, Sabrina felt a sense of both relief and trepidation. The woman who walked out of prison was not the same girl who had been locked away all those years ago. She was stronger, more resilient, and determined to use her second chance to make a difference in the lives of others. Upon her release, Sabrina started her own initiative called Free Paths. The program provided support for women and girls who had suffered from abuse, offering counseling, educational opportunities, and resources to help them rebuild their lives. Sabrina dedicated herself to ensuring that others wouldn't fall into the same traps she had, empowering them to reclaim their lives and their futures. Her past, though painful, had given her the tools to help others who were struggling in ways she had once struggled. As the years passed, Sabrina's work with Free Paths flourished, touching countless lives and providing the support many young women needed to escape cycles of abuse and manipulation. She had become a symbol of survival and transformation, a testament to the possibility of redemption despite even the darkest of pasts. Yet despite her success and the lives she had touched, Sabrina could never quite overcome the scars left by Richard. Though she helped others reclaim their voices, Sabrina remained distant from romantic relationships. The trust that had once been shattered by Richard's betrayal was something she knew she could never rebuild. Not with another man, not with anyone. She understood the importance of self-love and independence, and her energy was now entirely focused on her mission to empower others. Trusting someone else is like opening a door to the unknown, she would often say in her speeches, reflecting on her own painful lessons. And I learned in the hardest way that not all doors lead to safety. Her journey had taught her that true strength didn't come from depending on others, but from relying on herself. I've learned that the only person I can truly trust is me, Sabrina would say with conviction. She had found power in her independence and had grown into someone who could offer guidance to others, even if it meant leaving her own emotional needs unfulfilled. Looking back on her life, Sabrina didn't see herself as a victim or as the murderer the world had once labeled her. Instead, she saw a woman who had survived, who had refused to let her past define her, and who had found a way to make something good from all the pain. "I'm not defined by what was done to me, nor by what I did," she said in her quiet moments of reflection. "I'm defined by what I chose to do after everything that happened." As she moved forward, Sabrina walked alone but not in solitude. Her path was one she had carved herself, filled with purpose and the quiet strength of someone who had learned to heal and, in turn, help others do the same. Her story had come full circle, not as a tale of destruction, but as a story of recovery and resilience. Sabrina's journey would continue, one where the lessons learned from her past would guide her as she helped others avoid the same traps, find their strength, and ultimately forge their own paths to freedom. Welcome to Spooky Stories, the channel where thrilling and mysterious tales come to life. Here you'll hear stories based on real events with names and details changed to protect identities and, of course, to avoid any legal issues. So, get ready to dive into intriguing cases full of twists and turns that will keep you hooked until the very end. If you enjoy chilling and surprising stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. And don't forget to leave a like. It helps us bring even more amazing tales to you. At the end of this video, we've got a suggestion for another thrilling case waiting just for you. Stick around and uncover the secrets behind these dark stories with us.